Hailing from the Jersey Shore and raised as athletes, the Airey Bros have always shared a passion for physical culture, athletic performance, and human optimization, always striving to be the strongest versions of themselves, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Along the way, they've met some pretty amazing humans and have had some pretty epic adventures. The intention of Airey Bros Radio is to showcase these amazing people and the impact that they've had on them, and to share tips, tricks, and hacks so that you can win each day, every day.
You're listening to Airey Bros Radio. Be there or be square, because it's all killer, no filler.
The Airey Bros podcast. A couple dudes, built pretty good, look good.
You just haven't sequenced enough DNA to confidently say whether or not you can find any distinguishing characteristics. It shows some slippage of the toes and sort of leveraging off the ball of the foot rather than showing the midfoot flexibility that's so characteristic of the human. Now I have over 300 footprint casts in my lab from all over, and I shouldn't say all varieties, but different individuals, different individual variation, as one might expect for a biological population. You can't engage the evidence and weigh the evidence and draw a conclusion without then following through with the implication. And in this case, it in my mind confirmed the existence. I'm not approaching the question of Sasquatch from wearing the hat of a cryptozoologist, but rather as an academic anatomist and anthropologist, a student of primate evolutionary biology. This is Jeff Meldrum. You're listening to Airey Bros Radio.
The reason we really want to get you on is because, a lot of times I think if the topic of Bigfoot comes up, people just pass it off as, folklore or certain different things. But you actually come to this topic with a lot of accreditation. So we'd really like to kind of get into it with you. Your book, Sasquatch and the Legend Meets Science. Mm-hmm. So, and you also have quite an interesting educational backstory where I believe you got your first degree was in zoology.
That's right. Yeah. Bachelor's and master's both in zoology.
And then now you're also a professor not only of anthropology, but anatomy.
Right. Principally anatomical sciences. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how along the way in all this journey did you get into Bigfoot, Sasquatch?
Right. Well, it really has its roots even further back than my academic career. As a youngster, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and my grade school years were spent in Spokane, Washington. And it just happened that was one of the premier showings of Roger Patterson's documentary, homespun documentary that showcased the Patterson-Gimlin film. And so I managed to convince my dad to take my younger brother and me to a showing at the Spokane Coliseum. First I'd ever heard of Bigfoot. And so but it was something that obviously enthralled me. I was fascinated by all things sort of prehistoric and mysterious, and interested in human evolution and cavemen and primates, primate behavior, and so forth. And so this just sort of rolled all those topics into one package with a bow on top of it. And so I was smitten. I was fascinated by the topic and pursued it as one that age would. And at that time, before copy machines were common and things like that. So I made use of the library and microfiche of old newspaper and magazine articles and various references. Obviously, Ivan Sanderson's book, which is still a classic, Bond the Snowman legend come to life, was required reading, and John Green, a Canadian journalist, not too far removed from Spokane, there up against the Canadian border, had written a very insightful book, very campy for that period. He had typed it on his typewriter, and so it had this real kind of newspaperish kind of feel to it, but had a lot of information. John was an extremely insightful and intelligent man who brought a level of rigor. His goal was to constantly put this topic before the scientists and to try to garner serious consideration. So it wasn't just the sensational hype that you often get in journalism today. But that's how the ball got rolling, so to speak, and that interest waxed and waned over the years. And I had big plans when I graduated from high school. We were going to go on a Bigfoot hunt. There's even little notations in my senior class yearbook, my classmates wishing me luck and don't let Bigfoot get you and that kind of thing. So that was at a time when the interest was kind of keen. And then, as I pursued my academic career and perhaps a bit more cynicism, if you will, or objectivity combined, dosed with cynicism, I was much less optimistic that there was going to be a positive outcome to any efforts to try to resolve that question. But I tell you, that turned around after a series of events, which involved an invitation to evaluate a piece of video footage from Northern California that I thought would just be a fun exercise to point out the zipper, just a forensic investigation. Here's why it couldn't be real. And what I discovered was something that was much more intriguing, and I couldn't find the proverbial zipper. And that sort of turned me around a little bit and got me thinking about some things, and a couple other opportunities presented themselves, one of which was the opportunity to actually witness footprints in the ground, fresh footprints, not just a single track, in a mud puddle or something, but a long line of footprints along a very silty clay farm access road in southeastern Washington state. And 15-inch tracks that were so fresh, there was still evidence of dermatoglyphics in some of the prints. And that really set me back, because that moment of that aha moment where you suddenly realize that, my gosh, these are the real thing. A Sasquatch actually walked by here last night. And so that changed, that dispelled the cynicism. And certainly I've always tried to maintain the objectivity of a scientist, detached scientist. But that was a thrilling moment when that realization struck that this was really compelling evidence. So that one thing led to another. Now I have over 300 footprint casts in my lab from all over, and I shouldn't say all varieties, but different individuals, different individual variation, as one might expect for a biological population. And yet from that variation emerges this remarkably consistent, coherent, biomechanically sound anatomy that distinguishes a Sasquatch track from a human or other potential misidentification. It's pretty amazing, because the implication is so profound. You can't engage the evidence and weigh the evidence and draw a conclusion without then following through with the implication. And in this case, it in my mind confirmed the existence. And that stands as a stark contrast to, for example, a colleague of mine who took exception to an article that was written by invitation from the California Academy of Sciences, and she was the principal objector, representing the opinion of some members of the Scientific Advisory Board that such a thing had no place in the publication of the California Academy of Science. And her retort when pressed was, they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence you think you have. So what kind of an attitude is that for an objective, open-minded scientist? I mean, it's actually, it's an indefensible position to adopt now. I mean, back then, I can see, I understand the historical things, the principles and developments and paradigms that influenced anthropology that would give her some intellectual cover for such an attitude, even though in principle the attitude is absolutely wrong. But I can understand a little bit about where it's coming from. Now, several decades later, you just can't defend that position. It's indefensible to say that it's impossible, given what we now know about the pattern and process and evidence of human evolution, to say that it's impossible that such a thing were to exist it's just baseless now. So you're left with then the probability. What's the likelihood? How compelling is the evidence, and what are the implications of the or what are the consequences of the implication of that evidence? Can those be accommodated by our current understanding of paleontology and anthropology and ecology and so forth? And the answer is a resounding yes. It's just we come up short with the conclusive evidence, but theoretically, it's absolutely reasonable that such a creature would exist.
And you said you had over 300 casts in your lab that you've examined. Are those all from the same location, or are they all over the place?
Well, they're all over the place. And there's even examples quite far-flung. I have a pair of casts from the Republic of Georgia, the North Caucasus Mountains, and over in Asia, and they're exactly like a Sasquatch track. I mean, they're big 16.5-inch footprints. I've got examples from other parts of Russia, from China, from even a couple of supposed Yowie. Yowie's still the ringer. Australia presents a whole different situation because there, the biogeography does make it rather challenging to rationalize a large bipedal primate, short of something that's very, very human-like. And the reports don't seem to justify that. So what exactly the Yowie is, I don't know. That's a whole different topic to pursue. But yeah, the other regions of the United States and Canada, I mean, places where you would expect to find them. And there are a few that are, and they are few, that are ringers that are clearly attempts at fabrication or are just so ambiguous they're really worthless. They only resemble a Bigfoot track in the most vague proportions and outline, but no details are preserved. But the outright blatant hoaxes are pretty rare. They really are the exception rather than the rule, from what I've found.
And you mentioned the Caucasus and China, and even in a random place like Australia, which doesn't maybe necessarily match, but across the board, different cultures and societies have the folklore, be it a Yeti, a Sasquatch, Bigfoot. There's all these different names. In your experience and in your work and in the cast that you have, would you say that we are dealing with one specific species, or is there maybe different types of bipedals that kind of are falling into this category?
It seems to be the latter, that there seems to be different types of, so these, we now see human evolution as this very bushy tree with radiating branches and many species coexisting across the landscape at various slices in the past, slices of time. in the past. And so what we see, I think, are just relics. These are individual branches that have persisted in particular regions. So through, North America and over into Asia, all the way over to the Caucasus, kind of hooking down south a little bit, skirting the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau and that, we have something that looks very much like a Sasquatch. I mean, it's a large-bodied bipedal primate. Let's call it generically primate, that has a non-divergent big toe and leaves a footprint that is remarkably consistent. Then there's, in areas of Western Asia, some of the mountain ranges that skirt Mongolia and over into East Europe are the Russian almas, which seems to be something like a Neanderthaloid, maybe, if we can use that term, or Denisovan. I mean, now there was a recent paper that potentially cast Denisovans in a very different light, but that area where those footprints are being found, which are much more human-like, but very broad and splayed, clearly creatures that have not worn shoes, but they do have an arched foot in a more modern, more human-like sense. And the behaviors and description of the almas is something that is a little more hominin-like, more human-like, often with differentiated head hair, but still covered with hair on their bodies, but sometimes attributed with using stone tools, attempting to articulate, to vocalize with local people, trading with them, sometimes even being taken in sort of as a housemate, keeping an elderly person company. Much more human-like aspects of qualities to them. Then there's the Himalayan Yeti, those stories, which unfortunately, when you sift through a lot of the reports of footprints, for example, there's a lot of misidentification and misattribution, things that are clearly bear footprints, BEAR, bear, and there's a lot of conflation there, even in the cultural aspects, between the man bear and the Yeti. Excuse me. But the principal distinction there is a very divergent big toe. They have a more ape-like foot, one that suggests that they still are retreating to or foraging in the forest canopy, which they occupy, these subtropical to temperate high elevation forests in the valleys of the Himalayas, not the snowfields and high mountain passes where the tracks are sometimes found as they're moving from valley to valley. But it's a very scant record. I mean, a thorough survey of the Yeti footprints, those attributed to the Yeti, reveals that there's only probably 3 or 4 at most that are representative of a hominoid, that are not just, so unintelligible that they're indeterminate, or are, like, as I pointed out, are misidentified bear tracks. And then finally, the fourth category, and this is interesting because, you go back and you look at Ivan Sanderson's book, which was published in 1960, early 60s. And that was the conclusion that he had drawn from all of his survey of the literature and the world traveling he had done. He finally settled on 4 categories. And these 4 that I'm describing parallel those. But the last one are the little people, like Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, being discovered in areas where things like the orang pendek, the endutu, the ibu gogo, there are different terms on the various islands of the Indonesian archipelago and throughout Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Thailand and so forth. So those are the 4. Now there might be even more. I'm working right now on a paper with Dr. Tran Viet, who's a Vietnamese anthropologist who was part of a team which shortly after the conflict there came to culmination, participated in a biological survey of the Central Highlands which unfortunately had been, quite devastated by the war, and they wanted to assess the biodiversity that remained. And he discovered a footprint, and it's not huge, it's not like a gigantic footprint like a Sasquatch, but it's bigger than the human populations there, which are quite diminutive. The natives who would be running around without shoes, the natives are quite short in stature, barely over 5 foot, with a foot that's only about 8 inches, and this is a little over 12 and a half inches. But yet it shows evidence of an arch. It shows some slippage of the toes and sort of leveraging off the ball of the foot, rather than showing the midfoot flexibility that's so characteristic of the human footprint. So it might reflect something that is more human-like, perhaps something like a relict Denisovan, or something that's more equivalent to the Russian almas, but that maybe they do have a distribution that takes it into Southeast Asia. So it's intriguing to see how many will, that will ultimately be resolved. We can speculate and theorize about what the possibilities are, and kind of frame in the potential differentiation of the types. But ultimately, it's going to have to wait until we have specimens to finally make those resolutions.
And we have the cast. Have you examined any hair, any DNA? Has there ever been a nest or anything like that people have stumbled upon that gives us more evidence? And I guess the main question that you probably hear all the time, why haven't we had more interaction with these creatures?
Well, to the first part of that question, yes, in terms of hair, we definitely have hair samples that defy attribution to any commonly known wildlife. And they exhibit remarkably consistent characteristics across numerous independently collected samples in various regions across, the United States. Excuse me. And after having, to identify a hair, typically the procedure is a process of comparison and contrast to known samples. So you have to have a collection of known samples. And those are historically were placed under a comparison microscope where you could put them side by side, like you see on the CSI television shows, and they line up the shafts and see how similar they are. And yes, we have those. Unfortunately, one of the characteristics that seems to distinguish the Sasquatch hair rather consistently, quite consistently, is the lack of a cellular medulla. That is the central core, where when it's cellular, it has remnants of dead cells from the follicle. And that's where you get the nuclei and mitochondria from which DNA is going to be. In a hair that lacks a cellular medulla, that has a quiescent, a follicle that's not actively growing, there's precious little cellular material, intracellular material remaining. It's just the shaft of the hair is the cortex is keratin, just an extracellular protein. So we don't have any DNA samples that we can confidently say, well, this is Sasquatch. And there's a reason for that, I believe, because one, this creature, these creatures, plural, make sure that's clear, as a species are probably very closely related to humans. Obviously, at least, and almost certainly much more closely related to humans than any other grade ape. So we know chimps share 90, 96, 97, 98% identity of DNA with humans. And so this creature may even be even more similar, 98, 99, 99.5% similar. So we may be talking about, 1/10 or 5 or 0.5% difference. Most of the analyses that have been done to date have been just kind of quick. I don't want to say quick and dirty, but quick and superficial studies using, using a marker that readily differentiates major groups of mammals. And unfortunately, if only a few thousand bases are sampled, then you may only find, or may only expect, and assuming that these distinctions are evenly spread throughout the genome, in a few thousand bases, you may only find a couple of differences, a couple of substitutions. That's not much to go on, and that's again assuming that if they're equally distributed, which they're almost certainly not. It's like I've used, and I'll probably wear it out here, but it's a good analogy to help people to understand. Imagine you have an Advent calendar and a bunch of little doors, leading up to Christmas Day. And let's say that instead of the 24 doors on your Advent calendar, we've got, say, 1,000 doors. And behind those doors, instead of a little goodie or a little chocolate or something, there is the identification of a particular gene marker. And scattered then throughout there, if we're talking, just to make it simple, let's talk about 1%. Then that means 10 of those doors of those 1,000 may have some distinguishing information in it. But you only have a study that permits you, because of time and resources, funding, to open 10 doors in total. So of those 1,000 doors, and you're only opening 10, what are the odds that you're going to find one that will confidently differentiate Sasquatch from human DNA? Pretty low odds. And this is why it requires, so up to now, if DNA has been gleaned from one of these samples that, based on the anatomy of the hair, we're pretty confident is from a Sasquatch. Either they come back with an identity of human, and so there's, in which case there's two explanations. One is that it was contaminated through handling by the witness, or two, that it simply is a misidentified human hair that just has been picked up, But the third possibility that hasn't been addressed is that you just haven't sequenced enough DNA to confidently say whether or not you can find any distinguishing characteristics. And I started discussing this. I started bringing this up with colleagues, geneticists, and asking what they thought about this third scenario. And they said, oh yeah, you're right. For something like you're describing, potentially, you would want to do the entire mitochondrial genome and probably a dozen or so, or 24 nuclear genes to boot, to be sure that you have enough coverage to differentiate. So that's the problem we're facing. I think that's the next big hurdle. Nests, yeah, there's been some really interesting stuff. There's long been suggestions that some structures were nests, or other tree structures that have been suggested as some sort of territorial marker or some other purpose that no one has been able to sleuth yet. There was some really interesting examples discovered recently, well, a few years back now. It's been well over 5 years, I guess, but up in the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, really fascinating nests that I had the chance to examine. And I mean, they had structure. They weren't just a bunch of debris that's piled up and matted down like a bear would make, for example. Instead, they were literally kind of built up and woven and some debris, but then in the vicinity, there were these big, tall, 7 to 8 foot tall evergreen blueberry trees, and they had snapped off all the green spriggers up at the top, up 7 foot high. I mean, you could see where they were snapped off, even when I was there several years later, because the broken stem had the distinctive growth, just like when you prune a hedge and you get that profusion of lateral, collateral buds germinating. That material was then not just piled up, but it was interwoven like a bird's nest. It was really quite remarkable. These things, they're not common. My personal thought, just in short, is that this was a special event. And I think it was probably a birthing event. I think that a female was probably pregnant and about to give birth, and that some of the clan had congregated for this unusual because the birth interval I suspect, in Sasquatch, as it is with other large non-human primates, is quite significant. Orangs, for example, which are probably the best social analog of social structure and behavior, have an interbirth interval anywhere from 4 to 7 years between births, unlike humans that have evolved, where the female can become pregnant, almost immediately, unless nursing. I mean, the longer nursing goes, and there's some suppression, but not entirely, of ovulation. Anyway, so yeah, that. Now, your final question was, why do we run into these things so infrequently? Well, it's somewhat a matter of perception, because people have the idea that they're not interacting with humans a lot. And what do you mean by a lot? It's like I'm always reminded of this sort of question. I was doing an interview one time, and one of the callers was a very skeptical individual and was trying to point out what he felt was my insufficient skepticism. And he was trying to, for example, citing Elizabeth Loftus's work. She's a psychologist who has specialized in memory, the function and nature of memory, and especially in forensic situations and litigations and adjudications, the use of memory for eyewitness testimony, and also regressed memories of individuals who have been traumatized in their youth or something like that. And he was pressing me, "Are you familiar with her work?" And I said, "Well, of course, yes, I am." And he said, "Well, then you must realize you can't rely on eyewitness testimony. You have to throw it out." I said, "Well, no, that's not what she's advocating." And in fact, there have, in the past 20 years, there's been a lot of research in the wake of her notoriety that have swung the pendulum back a ways, and that under certain circumstances and conditions, eyewitness memory is actually remarkably informative and reliable. Anyway, but my point was, you're comparing apples and oranges here. You have a scenario of a little old lady who's been mugged by a purse snatcher, and she's trying to identify someone from these 5 suspects that have been lined up. I said, that's quite different than an experienced outdoorsman asked to differentiate between a moose and a deer and a bear and a wolf and a Bigfoot and a backpacker. It's quite a different challenge altogether. But anyway, the point that was really, I think, struck home as to his perception bias was the conversation went on a little tit for tat and back and forth, and he was getting frustrated at my unwillingness to yield the point to him. If he comes back rather exasperated and said, "Well, if there was an 800-pound gorilla out there, people would be seeing it." And I said, "Well, now, isn't that where we started this conversation? The point is, people are seeing it and reporting it, but you're dismissing their testimonials right off the bat as unreliable evidence." And so people do, and it's interesting. Sometimes we gauge based on social media and website postings and databases and so forth, but I've often found it when I go out and I'm doing research in the field, especially when I'm in a new area, we're rubbing shoulders with people at the diner and at the hotel and wherever we're shopping in town or whatever, and we try to kind of bring it up. Sometimes we actually advertise. We wear a T-shirt that has, have you seen Sasquatch on it or something? And it's amazing for these people in the local environment. It's just part of the landscape, and they. It's like, why is such a big? I mean, why would you be here doing this? They say to us, and I try to explain the motivation of a scientist. Someone who's exploring and investigating, and it seems like a little bit maybe out of whack, or a disproportionate attention to it. It's like I had to laugh when John told me this. John Vindernagel, when we were discussing this kind of thing, he said, well, yeah, he had learned something. He was up following up on a report, and it had taken place on an Indian reservation, and he was out actually looking at the site where this, father and son who were fishing or whatever had actually seen one right on the trail and in close proximity and so forth. And he was out there just kind of reconnoitering, and a group of teenage boys came up. I think they were on their way to go fishing, and they were on the trail, and so he chatted them up and was asking them about this, and oh yeah, they knew about it, and he said, well, have you seen any evidence, any sign? He said, oh yeah, we see footprints on the trail, once in a while. And he said, well, have you ever taken pictures of them? And they all just kind of looked at each other and looked back at him and just laughed and said, well, why would we do that? It's just a totally different mindset. For John, he's the scientist. He's got to document it. He's got to photograph it and analyze it and so forth. For these guys, it's just, it's like, well, it's like a squirrel running across the path. Well, did you get a picture of it? Well, why would I do that? So now, having said that, though, I do want to emphasize that I'm convinced that they are extremely rare, relatively speaking. And we're talking about a large-bodied, long-lived, slow reproducing, as we said earlier, ape, hominoid, ape or hominin, if you want to say that, but in which case, being at the top of their food chain, they're apex species. There's probably not a lot of them. I've gone through a little exercise, and I won't go through all the details with you, but just based on a lot of these little correlations and brackets, based on analogy with extant great apes and human behavior and so forth, and then also the ecology and natural history parameters that we can infer based on clues, like solitary social structure, because most sightings are of single individuals. Most footprints are of single individuals or females with offspring. And I alluded to the analogy of the orang social structure. Anyway, based on a variety of clues and inferences from data and extrapolation, I suspect that their home range is about 1,000 square miles, just as a ballpark, where a dominant male advertises his presence in that range, which happens to overlap some females. And when the females are receptive, as is the case with the orangutan, they will seek out the dominant male for companionship, for procreative purposes. But otherwise, these are fairly solitary individuals. Well, if you look at something like the state of Idaho, and you look at, and there's two other factors. One is we've others before me have demonstrated, drawn attention to a very good correlation between rainfall and Sasquatch distribution. You need about 20 inches of precipitation annually to have the type of forest, type of the ecosystem that would support a large omnivore. And two, through using GIS, Geographic Information System methodologies, ecological modeling software, there's a good case that black bear and Sasquatch have, not surprisingly, very similar bioclimatic requirements for their habitat. And so that's the second question. So you look at a map, where does 20 plus inches of precipitation occur, and where are there black bear? So it takes in both the sort of the physical and the biotic elements and influences. If you do that in Idaho, and then see how many of these 1,000 square mile plots you can fit, you come up with about 15, just ballpark for discussion. Say 15, and each of those has, 5 to 10 individuals potentially associated with that area. So 5 times 15, 75, 10 would be 150. By comparison, there's 35,000 black bear in Idaho. So when you start to consider that, just acknowledge or recognize that potential disparity in numbers, 35,000, 150, or even if you want to double that, go up to 300 in all of Idaho. Then you see why almost all sightings, all credible sightings, happen purely by happenstance, by chance. There are very few instances where people have intentionally gone out looking for evidence and find it. It happens. Footprints, if you're spending the time walking or driving the trails and roads and spending a lot of time where animal tracks can be seen, but even then it's rare. In my career of 25 years now, that I've seen maybe 5 sets of footprints in the field that I'm pretty confident of were clear. Only a couple of those were really, really clear that I would permit good casting of the impression. And I've heard a few vocalizations. Never had maybe an encounter. I've had an encounter without non-visual encounter, something that left footprints and brushed up against the tent, and then I may have caught a glimpse just a couple of years ago up in Alberta through night vision under very poor conditions of observation, but very, very good chance that it was indeed a Sasquatch. So there you have it.
Interesting. Well, first thing, I think we need to take the word skeptic back, because I feel like if you're just supporting the mainstream narrative, you are not the skeptic in this situation.
Sure.
There's that, and then also, I'm an ultra marathoner, so I do a good amount of trail running here in Colorado, and I've lived in Southern California as well, and I've had some mountain lion experiences. And the common consensus with those encounters is that if you see the mountain lion has already seen you and is aware of you. Right. So, again, going back to talking about, if we're talking about, something that has a very similar DNA to mankind, is potentially could be an intelligent, species. And if they don't want to be seen, they're not going to be seen. Maybe like you said, happenstance, you might catch them off guard or something. But for the most part, if they don't want to be seen, they're not going to be seen. And if you've spent any time in the woods, or if you've been a hunter, animals go, be it starvation or, animal, killed by another animal. Mm-hmm. You can walk in the woods your whole lifetime and never come across the skeleton. That doesn't necessarily mean that that deer or other animals don't live there. That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's that's one of the most frequent questions too, is, where are the bones? And one of my former colleagues here on campus, was, he's a paleontologist, and was, pointing out that we have a very extensive fossil record of the faunas of North America. And I said, well, we should just hang it up then? There are going to be no new discoveries?
And he said, well, no. I said, well, there's always a new find of a new species that up till now has eluded your discovery or other paleontologists' discovery. So I said, that's a very narrow criterion to apply here, because we know that the fossil record is very capricious. And as you point out, bones, Dr. Krantz used to routinely ask of groups when he would speak in public, how many have ever found a bear skeleton or a bear bone and in the wild that hadn't been killed by hit by a car or shot by a hunter and died subsequently. And he said in 20 years of asking, he never had someone say, yay, I did. I've asked it, not religiously, but occasionally. And I've had a couple of people who have volunteered examples where they have found, but extremely rare. I mean, it's very, very rare. When you think a friend of mine inquired of their DNR officer back in, I think it was Minnesota, and they estimated that winter kill of deer in that state was in excess of 10,000 deer would die each year of winter kill. And yet spring comes around and you're not tripping over deer carcasses. When you go out, on your runs or on hikes, nature is very fastidious about recycling resources, and calcium is at a premium. And so, I mean, even deer will chew on bones to get the calcium that's there. But all the rodents and gnawers, porcupines and squirrels and rabbits, and they make short order of any bones that aren't degraded simply by exposure to the elements. And acidic soils, particularly in the coniferous forests of the West, and volcanic soils lend to soil acidity. Now, one area that we might look for bones that there'd be a better chance of finding something would be in limestone caves, where the alkaline environment would be conducive to the preservation of bone. But again, the example we could turn to is Gigantopithecus. Here's a giant ape, a species that had a tenure of 1.5 million years in East Asia, at least Gigantopithecus blacki, if we look at the biggest far eastern species. And yet for all that time, we have the jaws of 2 individuals and a few thousand isolated teeth, which represent just a few hundred individuals. And we only have those because porcupines dragged those bones from the forests into the caves and chewed down all the soft spots, leaving the thickest, heaviest parts of the bodies of the mandible and the thick enameled crowns of the teeth. In many cases, just eating away the root and dentin up into the crown. So were it not for the concentrating action of those porcupines, those few porcupines, where they were preserved, we'd have no record of 1.5 million years worth of these 800-pound gorillas in the form of Gigantopithecus. So Sasquatch may be, as far as the fossil record goes, may be a fairly recent interloper into North America. I mean, we may be talking as little as tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years that it's been here. Compared to the 1.5 million years of Gigantopithecus in East Asia. So it's not surprising. It's frustrating. It'd be great. I mean, I keep waiting for that instant when someone's going to walk in with a bone. I had one phone call, a gentleman who was working on a big new power line in southern Oregon through the Rogue River country, which is prime Bigfoot territory, and very remote, very rugged. And he said, we were way back there. He said, and I found a skull. And he said, I think this is what you're looking for. And the guy says, I've had a human osteology course, which gave me a little more hope, a little more optimism. And I said, well, at your earliest convenience, send me a snapshot, send me a photograph. He did. It was a moose skull with the snout broken off, so it made the thing look flat, and it had just the molars. But I mean, the molars, if you're at all familiar with teeth, you know what deer teeth look like. They look like rasps. They have these alternating plates of enamel and dentin. They don't have the bulbous rounded cusps of a big primate. I mean, there's no comparison whatsoever. Anyway, so it was very disappointing. But I've learned just not to get my hopes up. You talk about bringing skepticism. One thing that people don't see, because they see me on the documentaries or publishing papers and whatnot, they don't see all the chaff that I winnow through on a daily basis. People sending me pictures and me carefully outlining the footprint to show them why it's a human footprint, and sending it back, or the bear track, or hair that can be very readily identified as some other form of wildlife. This, for example, this FBI story recently, where through the Freedom of Information Act, someone got an FBI report, a sample that had been submitted by Peter Byrne years and years ago. I was impressed that the FBI actually took the time and effort and analyzed it and wrote a response. He claimed he never received the response, but it was a deer hair. Now, deer have the most distinctive, they have a medulla that almost fills the shaft, and the medulla looks frothy, almost like honeycomb or bubbles. It's just the frothy bubbles in the, has just a very distinctive. I mean, if you don't have to have much training. If you start looking at hair, you very quickly recognize that distinction and can differentiate deer hair under the microscope. So I was very disappointed that it was sent in, because those kinds of mistakes, they add up. They're ticks against us, because they get tons of publicity, as we all saw, and then the implicit message is, sometimes it's the overt message. Well, as soon as any qualified examiner takes a moment and looks at this evidence, it immediately is dismissed or attributed to some common form of wildlife. Same thing happened. There was a paper even published by some biologists with the Forest Service, and hair had been retrieved. It was up in, I think it was in the Yukon. So it's Canadian Forest Service, but hair had been retrieved from a fence after a sighting, and it had been sent in, and they tested it, and it came back as bison. And so, and that got all kinds of fanfare. Bison, Bigfoot is nothing more than bison, misidentified bison sighting. And that's frustrating, but because it doesn't give acknowledgement or credence to the many samples that have not yielded DNA, but that have all the distinctions of morphology that are remarkably consistent. Like I said, across many independent samples, they're very human-like, they're primate-like, but they're grown to length. They don't have a cut end, which almost every human, no matter how long their head hair is, they've almost certainly had a haircut at some point or another. So it's either a nice sharp beveled cut, or it's sometimes frayed ends. You can't maybe tell exactly there, but this remarkably consistent lack of a cellular medulla.
You talk about checks against your work or your colleagues' work and stuff, and you see this kind of across the board with air quotes conspiracy theories or alternative thinking, where it's almost within the community of the subsect of itself, they're almost like cannibalizing themselves, where someone like yourself who is accredited and has done the research and is looking at this from a bipedal, but then you also have people within the community who think it's like a shapeshifter from another dimension, and then you also have people who think it's because back in like the mid to late 1800s, there was reports of a wild man. Wild man was like a common thing before Bigfoot. So then there's a whole other, at least in what I've learned in this is that there's other people that think it's some sort of a humanoid that has managed to, you know, be elusive for all these years. So it's tough to disseminate which is which and go from there.
It is, and it does, schisms like that really don't benefit at least someone like me who's trying to establish a credible footing for objective investigation. It I'm often very sensitive to what I perceive as the abuse of what's called Occam's razor, which, paraphrased by most, states that the simplest explanation is most likely the correct one. And that's not, first of all, that's not what Occam said. He never advocated that truth was simple, was the simplest answer, because what he was saying, and this gets a little esoteric into the philosophy of science, but it's an important concept, and that is what Occam was trying to impress was that science proceeds by a process we call falsification. It's not practical to test every possible scenario, every possible example. And so instead of proving your case by proving all possible examples, you attempt to falsify or nullify your knock the legs out from under your hypothesis by finding an exception. If you find just one contradiction, then you have to go back and examine your hypothesis and maybe make it a little more elaborate to accommodate the variable that you missed that addressed that exception. But only then are you justified in adding to your hypothesis or elaborating it. In the absence of those exceptions, you're supposed to stick with the simplest first. That's the way to systematically proceed with this principle of falsification. So the original translation of Occam's principle was basically one should not multiply factors unnecessarily. That's what he said. Okay, but in reality, we've learned with 2020 hindsight that many examples of science and nature, especially in biology, where things get kind of complex and messy, that the shortest route is not always a straight line, or the connection, I should say, is not always the shortest, straightest line between 2 points, because nature doesn't have a crystal ball. It doesn't know what this other point is out here, and so it's just stuck with the present and the immediate future and has to deal with changes as they occur. Anyway, so having said that, given this, plethora of ideas and attitudes and theories, conspiratorial or otherwise, my argument is simply that as a biologist, I look at this and I can see a straightforward accommodation for almost everything that I've experienced, let's put it that way, in terms of a biological entity. That Bigfoot is just one more, albeit rare and elusive, element of the natural community of fauna out there. It's just, one of the forest creatures. It may be distinctive in that it's more human-like than any other. It may boast more intelligence than your average bear, but I don't see anything in its behavior. I mean, it doesn't have a material culture. It doesn't have permanent home bases. It doesn't have fire use, despite claims to the contrary. I've seen no evidence of language other than the kinds of vocalizations and communication that you see in other animals. And in fact, Dr. Bindernagel did a wonderful job early on in his book, North America's Great Ape, the Sasquatch. And that's why he chose that name. That's become a touchy point for people who advocate, it's not an ape, it's not just an ape, it's a more human-like. But he was trying to emphasize that all of the anatomies and all of the behaviors that are evident in the reports of eyewitnesses can be very comfortably accommodated. I mean, except for some things like bipedalism, but even that is a matter of degree rather than a matter of kind. Chimps and gorillas are capable of upright walking for what we call facultative bipedalism instead of habitual. But so much of the other aspects are just what you would expect for a temperate great ape. And so until some evidence, I mean, I invite people to demonstrate their experiences and subjective interpretations. I mean, one example I frequently cite is there was, often claims of orbs, this association of balls of light with Sasquatch, or Sasquatch winking out and being replaced by a ball of light that goes dancing through the forest. Well, there was some individual online, making allegations to that end, and so I asked him. I said, "Well, I'd be delighted to see some documentation. I mean, do you have any photos at all?" "Oh, sure, I've got great photos of these." "Well, will you send me your best example?" And I always add, because I get very impatient with people who send me something and I'll be kind of critical of it and I'll not be impressed. And they say, "Oh, well, I've got better pictures." "Well, why don't you share the best?" I said, "Pick out the best example you have of these orbs and send it to me." So he sent me a picture. It was pollen. It was pollen from the pine trees. And he took a flash picture at night, and the flash illuminated all these little dots that were just floating around in the air. I mean, I've been in Colorado when the ponderosa pine forests are in full pollination, and you go out at night on a nice dry night with a breeze, and you turn your headlamp on, you almost can't see. It's like you're in a whiteout in a blizzard because it just disperses your headlamp. But for him, those were orbs of light. Those were little energy dots that were bouncing around. And so, I know people have individual experiences, and I've always said, those who live in glass houses aren't justified in throwing stones. And I'd be fascinated by some of these claims, but they're always they can never be documented. They can never. These people that have habituation experiences, you can't bring a camera or a recording device or anything, because they'll be offended and they'll leave or whatever. It's just so there is some. I guess I haven't lost my cynicism altogether.
So in your work, have you discovered any other cryptids that you think have validity, or as far as you're concerned, is it, these Bigfoots that we've come in contact with the cast and that's it? Or is there other cryptids that you think might exist out there?
Well, I haven't, as far as new species, I know that new species are still being discovered, and I certainly have a closet interest in cryptozoology generally, since I am a zoologist by training and interest. But I'm always reluctant to lump this topic in with cryptozoology generally, because I think it has done a disservice to it. I'm not approaching the question of Sasquatch from wearing the hat of a cryptozoologist, but rather as an academic anatomist and anthropologist, a student of primate evolutionary biology, and so I'm not as familiar. I've done a couple of things where it overlaps on some of my skill set. For example, there was a documentary on the chupacabra, and they had found and cast a footprint attributed to the chupacabra down in the southeast somewhere. And so I said, sure, yeah, I'll take a look at it. I'm fascinated. by footprints, and I know tracks pretty well, I think. And so I came. When they came, I was prepared, and I had on the bench, I had a whopping wolf track, a coyote, a domestic dog, a domestic cat, bobcat, and a cougar lined up. A series of four-toed digitigrade footprints, and then they unveiled their cast, and we just kind of went along this array, and I almost wished we had a little dinger that would, ding, 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 to show, because when we got to the domestic dog, you couldn't tell them apart. I mean, it was just, it was probably some, big hound or Weimaraner or something. I don't know what, it was a dog from the neighborhood that left just a really clear print up in the mud. So I took advantage to make a nice cast of it for my collection, my comparison collection. But these were so similar, they're so distinctive. They had the cast of a domestic dog. No one in their right mind would think otherwise after looking at that. One time I did a episode for the Dog Man, which is continually now growing in popularity and in interest, despite a rare, a real dearth of any kind of compelling evidence. And I agreed to do the interview on the basis that they would allow me to explore the possibility that that it was a case of misperception. In other words, the people that were having these dogman sightings, that we were down in Louisiana, and they were interested in the rougarou. And it took me back to my youth when I used to be, one of my favorite primetime cartoons was Johnny Quest. And there was an episode where they had the loup-garou, where they were hoaxing a werewolf to scare away the loggers so that they could monopolize the logging rights and so forth. Anyway, but loup-garou, rougarou, it comes from this old world tradition of the werewolf. And so my argument was that I see no evidence to support a big upright bipedal dog-like creature, but maybe it's a case, but we do know that there's evidence of the Sasquatch-like creature in those regions and sightings described as such. But maybe at night when it's dark and someone that has the cultural heritage from the old country of the rougarou, to them, any upright, shaggy, bipedal monster is the rougarou. And in spite of the notion of prick ears and snout and a long bushy tail, maybe those are just embellishments or just add-ons. There was a bush or a shrub or something that made it look like it had a tail, or who knows what. So it was an interesting conversation, interesting discussion, but I'm just not up on the latest in all the cryptozoological literature, but it's taken its knocks too. Unfortunately, and this is why I actually wrote a paper together with Bindernagel, where we kind of decried the disservice of lumping Sasquatch, the topic of Sasquatch, in with cryptozoology, because cryptozoology is seen as this sort of fringe pseudoscience that just as soon they're not, the cryptozoologists are not actively searching for creatures, and they kind of lean on the poster children of cryptozoology, or point to the discovery of a new species as justification for the discipline of cryptozoology. So it gets kind of doesn't get a good resounding endorsement amongst mainstream zoology.
You've got the famous picture right behind you over your shoulder. What are your thoughts on that photo, the video? And I'm sure you've seen all of that information.
Oh, absolutely. That I'm very familiar with, because early on in my involvement in this subject, I was kind of reluctant to address it head on too much. I didn't want I didn't want it to be the Zapruderer film. I didn't want it to be the basket that everyone was putting all their eggs in. And but as I became more familiar with it and its history, and more familiar with Bob Gimlin himself personally, and heard his story firsthand a number of times, and as I began to scrutinize it from my perspective, not from that youthful 11-year-old sitting on the Spokane Coliseum auditorium floor, but as an academic versed in comparative primate anatomy and primate locomotion, particularly in the evolution of bipedalism, I'm absolutely convinced, as much as I can be, short of having been there on the sandbar and witnessed it myself. If I had just the footprints alone, I would be very convinced that it was credible. But having the whole package, the footprint record that was cast by Roger, and as well as Bob Titmus, who came back later, and others who photographed some of the footprints in the ground, and to be able to examine that now in all its detail. It's interesting because the 50th anniversary came and went with very little fanfare. I was quite surprised how it was just sort of ignored when that anniversary year came and passed. But I decided to try to make amends for not having been more proactive myself. I was prepared for what I thought would be an onslaught of public journalistic interest, but it never materialized. So for the next couple of years, I, at every opportunity, spoke about the film with a 50-year advantage of hindsight. And that's what's really fascinating to me is when you look at it, what was the context of its presentation to the scientific community in 1967? What were the prevailing ideas? I mean, this also kind of came out of as I wrestled with the notion, why was there such a visceral rejection of the possibility that something like this could exist? When Ivan Sanderson published his book in the 60s, why was it just poo-pooed? I mean, he was a naturalist. He didn't have the ultimate terminal degrees behind his name, but he was a naturalist with experience in various wild habitats around the world, and was quite respected in that regard. But anyway, what changed, and is it any different now? Well, yes, things have changed dramatically. And just one quick example, the one that I get the biggest kick out of is John Napier was one of the scientists. He was a primatologist, had a lot of influence on my career as one of the founding sort of patriarchs of the study of primate locomotion. But he was amongst the scientists at the Smithsonian who viewed the film at one of its first US showings, and probably the most open-minded of the group. He went on and wrote over the course of the next several years a book that was a very important, let's put it that way, important contribution. I disagree with quite a number of the things that he concluded there, but I think a lot of that stemmed from limited sample size and writing it at the time when there was a lot of paradigm sort of stagnation, I guess you'd probably say. But one of the things when it came to that film, he, even though he's kind of intrigued, piqued by it, he still concluded that it must be hoaxed. But the only reason he could offer was, he said, when I look at it from the waist up, it looks like an ape, but from the waist down, it looks human-like in proportion. He said, I can't imagine such a hybrid, a mosaic existing in nature, so it must be contrived. Well, just literally a few years after his book was published in the early 70s, we had this burst of discoveries in paleoanthropology in East Africa, namely Australopithecus afarensis, or Lucy. and much more complete skeletal remains, pelvis, knees, that convincingly showed that she was bipedal, habitually bipedal, and showed the adaptations, many very modern-like adaptations, but still primitive traits. But when they described her to the popular press, what did they say? From the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee. From the waist down, she looks like a little person. Isn't this interesting how evolution has proceeded in such unexpected combinations of traits? Well, now wait a minute. That unexpected combination of traits was the linchpin, was the cudgel that Napier was beating them up on the Patterson-Gimlin film with. What if he had waited a few years before the book had been published, and if it was delayed a few years until after the discovery of Lucy and all of this discussion about this unusual characteristics? And we can go down a list of another half dozen items of unusual combinations of traits, which back in 1967 cut against the grain of what was common conventional wisdom. You know, things like a flat flexible foot with a non-divergent big toe, or a flat face with reduced canines, or on and on with other combinations of traits. And so how, Roger might have, or whoever was working with Roger, if it wasn't Roger himself, might have come up with a few characteristics, or one or two maybe, but a whole list of them. And if he was getting any consultation from someone who was in the know as far as anthropology, they wouldn't have picked those traits to include. I mean, it would have been a big, King Kong or something, like a big gorilla, bipedal gorilla or something. Anyway, so it's a fascinating piece of film footage. It still stands, it set the bar so high that nothing or few things have even approached it or rivaled it in quality and duration and visibility. There are a few things out there that are quite interesting, and lots of little snippets which, taken individually, aren't very impressive, but when you see a whole string of them with these repeated themes, then it starts to make you wonder. Most hoaxers don't address those kinds of anatomical detail.
Cool, thank you.
Jeff, do you have a daily practice or a daily ritual?
A daily ritual as far as this topic goes?
No, just
in life.
We're getting in general now.
Oh, I have my habits. I guess as you get older, you start to do things rather routinely, but nothing that would be of particular interest to your listeners, I don't think. But no, just, try to end the day on a good note and start it on a positive note as well. Get a good night's sleep. That's becoming more and more important.
Yeah.
Time goes on.
Jeff, are you a coffee drinker?
I'm not.
No. Okay.
No.
Do you drink tea or anything like that in the morning?
Herb teas I do, usually in the evening, not in the morning.
Okay.
But yeah, I enjoy, a dry cookie, a piece of Scottish shortbread, and a nice cup of hot herb tea of some kind or other.
Awesome.
What are you listening to right now? Music, podcasts, audiobooks? Are you reading anything?
Yeah. Well, I'm reading up on topics that relate to my writing projects right now. So I'm working on a book with a cultural anthropologist, Dr. Christopher Dyer, down in Gallup, New Mexico, where we had a singular opportunity to record sort of an open mic talking circle setting where numerous individuals from the Navajo Nation were very, very open and forthcoming with their traditional beliefs and contemporary experiences as it relates to the Yetso, which is the Sasquatch of the Southwest, someplace you don't really think about, but of Sasquatch. We think of Red Rock and desert, Sonora Desert, and so forth when we think about the Southwest, but the Colorado Plateau is flanked by islands of mountain ranges with montane forest and habitat that is extremely conducive, and there's a deep, rich history. So I've been doing a lot of reading on that. The other topic that I've been reading about a lot is there's a possibility I might be able to go do some work in Alaska. So I've been crunching up again, cramming, boning up on Alaskan history and lore and so forth. So I do that. That's the kind of reading I usually do. It just depends on whatever project. Listening, quite honestly, these days, when I'm working in the office, I've been listening a lot to just bird songs, ambient forest sound, and just find that very relaxing. But every once in a while, if I need some rousing, I like things like Jesse Cook. Is it Jesse Cook? I'm terrible with names anymore. Spanish guitar.
Okay.
I like acoustic guitar for ambient, or I get a little. I enjoy kind of the epic songs, like by Two Steps from Hell. That kind of epic. Once in a while, just for background, turn it way down so it's not distracting me, but have a little oomph to it. My interests are extremely eclectic, and I'm not super duper passionate about any one particular thing, and so I doff and don hats and preferences pretty as the mood that moves me. So I'm kind of hard. That's why I hate not hate, but I'm terrible at answering what's your favorite, because I just don't have very many favorites.
Yeah, we're just curious. I'm kind of the same way where, I'm a fan of a lot of things, but I would never say other than myself, I'm a super fan of anything. So a lot of times names and titles and things, they escape me. Last one for you. Like I mentioned earlier when we started, the first time I heard of you or came to know you was through Tinfoil Hat with Sam Tripoli. So the question, and before March of 2020, this was a more lighthearted question. Now it can sometimes take a different approach, but do you have a favorite conspiracy theory other than seeing an actual Bigfoot? If you could know the truth behind anything,
I'm one of those who is kind of intrigued by the total non-event of the revelation, the acknowledgement by the military of UFO studies and documentation. That's got me as curious as the conspiracy theories about suppression and Men in Black and all that, because I don't know what to think if they're actually acknowledging now that there are these unidentified aircraft that exceed anything that we have even a hint of capabilities by our own military, at least that is public knowledge. And that's one of the angles, I guess, that makes it interesting. It's either there's something that's far more advanced, be it retro-engineered or reverse engineered or not, than what we as a public are currently aware of, or there are other sources of technology that are monitoring, as has been suggested by so many people, our military activities and bases and foolishness sometimes. That's got me really intrigued. But the total lack of interest by the media has just got me. Maybe it's still the Trump derangement syndrome has dulled everyone's interest and curiosity. I mean, I have long thrown the mainstream media out the window. I can't even stand to watch, even this morning, the coverage, just to have them lie, bold-faced lie to you about the actual details and facts. And even when retractions or corrections come out, they're fine print footnote, page 3. This thing with NPR just galls me. I mean, I used to really look up to and enjoy NPR as an alternative to the network media, and I can't even stomach it anymore. They're just so hypocritical and so disingenuous. It's just it's a sad situation we find ourselves in. But
yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate your answers, your openness with everything, and the information you've shared with us today.
Sure.
In terms of your book and your works, where would you like to direct the people to? Do you want them going to Amazon? Do you have a website or?
I don't have it. I don't have a website, but Amazon is fine. They're all available there. My field guides and field notebook are published by a publisher called Paradise K. That's a CAY K. And so if they want to go to ParaCay, PARACAY.com, not only will you find my things, but Paradise K has now cobbled together quite an impressive lineup of not only books and field guides and so forth, but all sorts of things from metal fridge magnets and other gadgets and gizmos relating to Bigfoot. So it's kind of a little more fun than just going to Amazon. So
cool. We will put all that stuff in the show notes.